equity, and just all the conversations that led up to this conversation. I think it's important. I think it's a great example of how we get to know each other and work across difference, which is sometimes the tough part about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusivity, is taking the time to be able to connect with people that have different lived experiences. So for me, my lived experiences started in New Bern, which is 2 hours east of Raleigh. As that growing up, it's interesting because Raleigh was the big city. That was where we came to go school shopping, to get the new outfit, getting ready to be fresh in high school. We wanted to make sure that we had an outfit that we would not see repeated in school. So we had to go outside the city limits to go find that outfit that nobody else had, that whatever that was. So, but yeah, I'm from New Bern. I actually came to Raleigh via NC State, class of '98, go Pack, and really focused in honed my work around community reform. Did a lot of work and started out doing juvenile justice work, looking at school violence prevention, specifically looking at how do we help support and look at the risk factors to gang involvement, and did a lot of work with gang involved kids for years, a lot of gang intervention work. And at the foundation of it, it was really about how do we develop a community that can create the best outcomes possible. And we saw that reflected within our young people. And so ultimately, there's this old saying, well, actually a greeting by the Maasai people, is a West African population. Their salutation is Kasari and Ngera, which means, and how are the children? Because their belief is basically, if the children are well, then the people are well. So if the kids weren't well, that meant that our community was sick. That meant that our community and our ecosystems and the functionalities of all the elements to create a thriving young person is out of whack. So my work in community development, really, when I think about the end product, is our babies. Ultimately, we want the best for our kids, and so that led me into working into a nonprofit that focused specifically on increasing graduation rates and looking at building community support and infrastructures of support for young people, and to address issues of social disorganization. And those types of conversations are not just conversations about what's wrong with the kid. It's about what's going on, what's the community of support, what are the access to opportunities, where there are the conversations about the quality of education, looking at issues related to the parent being able to be actively engaged in their young person's academic journey. And if they are having to cobble together a living wage with 2 to 3 jobs, then their inability to be able to be present in their child's academic life becomes even harder to do. And so the opportunity to focus on issues related to equitable economic development, inclusive prosperity, was at the heart of, again, going back to the greeting, Kasari and Ngera. The question is, how are the kids? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So it really has been a journey where you just grow more and more passionate about, youth and community advocacy. And in a sense, that kind of led you to what you're doing today, right? Can you tell us a little bit of what's your role right now with the chamber?
Yeah, absolutely. The chamber houses our Wake County Economic Development, which is the arm of our county's economic development strategy. We support the business recruitment, retention, building our ecosystem. We tout that we are an incredible magnet. This region is an incredible magnet to the country. We rival most metros. The question is really about the quality of our ladder. And this is something that our president of our incredible community college, Wake Tech, Dr. Scott Rawls, talks about all the time. The quality of our ladder, and the question is about upward mobility. And so I was brought in to really focus in on what we call equitable economic development, and a construct of inclusive prosperity. How do we tap into full participation by all residents to to ensure success. And we identified communities that were not growing at the same rate as other communities, and we created a vulnerability index. And that index took data points like poverty, graduation rate, housing vacancy, all of those elements, aligning with the 13 building blocks of economic mobility to identify the areas and the gaps that we have that are preventing, that are barriers to inclusive prosperity. And that work really became about understanding the community factors of economic mobility, which is transportation, housing, how do we support our small business and entrepreneurial ecosystems? But at the same time, how do we support the existing infrastructures, the existing anchors within the community, those existing companies and industries and their own diversity, equity, and inclusivity strategy, because they are a big player in creating opportunities for everyone. So our diversity, equity, and inclusivity conversation with supporting our existing industry started with, asking the question, we were on a journey as a community about, diversity and inclusion. And one of the well-renowned thought leaders in this space would say that, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And, I would like to assert in that same breath, her name was Verna Myers, is we needed to add the E to this conversation, because equity is, how does the person get to the party to begin with, to be asked to dance? They could be invited, they certainly may have an opportunity to be asked to dance if the ecosystem is ready, but how do they get there to begin with? And that's the conversation around building bridges or removing barriers. So that's a deep penetrating systems conversation. That's looking at our practices, our programs, and our policies that all interact with whether it is unintentionally creating inequities, or looking at conversations around folks that may have had mindsets and belief systems that created those or perpetuated those disparities. So there's a lot going on in this conversation, but my position was the result of a community and leadership that have been talking about this. It starts with the conversation. And so I tell folks that, we have a lot of political and social will, like there's this collective will to do it. The question is about ideating around and creating a strategy to actually execute it.
That's fantastic. And I can hear the passion in just the way you're talking about it. But before I forget, I forgot to mention that for our audience, if you have any questions, we're going to have a Q&A session towards the end. So just type your questions in on the Q&A box. We'll be happy to go over that. So Danya, with everything that you're doing, you're engaging with so many different community leaders, organizations in the area. Where do you see that? What is Raleigh doing well right now? And maybe what are things that maybe we're not doing so well that we need to focus more on right now?
That it's tough because, and I say this not because I don't want to answer. I say it because it's complex, right? It's like if the city of Raleigh or the county, we had our own Facebook page, and you can talk about your status, married, single, or it's complicated, that's where we would be. It's complicated. And I say it's complicated because we are all at different levels, and so one of the things that I've seen amazingly as an amazing win is the willingness to be uncomfortable with talking about these challenges. And I'll say that after this summer that we all had to endure as a nation and let's just say globally, we've all had to endure challenges, but what really hit home was obviously the murders of George Floyd and the subsequent conversations around the murder of Breonna Taylor and also Ahmaud Arbery. That accelerated the conversation that we had launched and conversations that have been since 2016. Conversations based off of the landmark study by Dr. Raj Chetty from Harvard that talked about the percentage chance of young people who grew up in a certain zip code. You can actually predict how the probability of them being successful from moving from the bottom 20% to the top 20%. And Dr. Chetty asserted that the lowest probability for that level of upward mobility was in the southeastern parts of our country. And in North Carolina, in our community, we have our levels are, I mean, extremely low for area code 27615. For a young person who actually was born in that community, if they stayed in that community, the likelihood of them moving up was around 6%, from moving from the top 20, the bottom 20% to the top 20%. So that says that our ladder is just, it's not functioning the way that the dream that we all have been exposed to is being to complete citizens in this country. The notion that if you work hard, you will achieve success. So for us, the huge win for us, I think, is the willingness to have that tough conversation, is to bring that mirror and to say, all of our residents are not experiencing these same things. They are not experiencing that ladder of upward mobility the same way. Recognizing that we have community members that are born into privilege and have more opportunities than others. And so the question of equity became more or less about how do we disarm what equity means. It's not about taking away from those that have to give to those that don't. No, not at all. That's not what it is. It's about creating access and recognizing that there is a disparity. And so the community, to me, the win is, and why it's so complex, is that, you know, the win is hard to quantify. There's an air, and there's, you know, our community leaders are, I think, singing from the same playbook, the same sheet of music. We're all playing off that now. We're strategizing to figure out what do we need to do on what pillars, but there hasn't been much resistance to the direction that we're going, which I think that is, when I speak to my counterparts in other communities across the country, you know, they're just getting to the point where they're trying to make a business case for it. Like they're having to not come at it from, you know, we stand on an intersection that is not only, there's not only a business case for it, but it's also the right thing to do. Right. And you know, the business case for us, I mean, like, yeah, absolutely. If you increase diversity, you get a better product. And research tells us that it is indeed what I like to call the superior growth model, okay, when we address this work. But at the same time, we are saying it is not right when we talk about the rising tide and, you know, raises all boats, and recognizing that we have some boats on the horizon that aren't seaworthy. So that means that we need to address those boats so they can fully participate in the rising tide.
That is so interesting, because even today I was having a conversation with a colleague that, you know, there's a lot of confusion between the word equity and equality, right? And they have very different meanings. Equity is supporting those that need, you know, it's kind of like, not all of us need glasses, right? Yes. But you know, we wear them to be able to see better. So it's kind of helping, you know, those that need that extra push so that they can have the equal opportunities that others that, you know, absolutely, in other situations have, because of their backgrounds, have it. And so that's interesting, because one thing also with international focus, you know, we have a global audience. Do you have an idea of how Raleigh is perceived abroad in terms of DEI?
You know, it's interesting because, and, you know, I can't tell the story of everybody's narrative of how they perceive our community. The stories that I have heard, you know, there's a mixed bag. You know, you have the one intersection is because we are a Southern state, you know, even though we're North Carolina, we are still part of this, you know, Southern community. And that being said, there's obviously this old historical narrative about the South that we are still navigating that space, right? And then you have, you know, more recently, within the last 5 to 7 years, the conversation around the HB2 in the bathroom bill. And the question is, are we truly inclusive to our LGBTQIA plus community? And so we're still navigating those types of conversations. And luckily, we have community, we have companies and folks that are looking to relocate. They are asking pointed questions about this, which raises our awareness about how important it is. And so it's not just the folks that have been advocating for this, but it's for the person that maybe did not know that it was a priority for companies to make sure that the community is diverse and inclusive. Maybe thinking that was something that was an add-on and not really baked into the culture. It's not a cost center. I mean, you know, working on DEI doesn't take away from the company. It actually builds onto. It's not a part of the cost center. It's a part of the revenue builder. And so us thinking about the narratives that are outside of our community and recognizing that it is a value proposition. And then there's an incredible intersection that we know that's coming up that just goes across, it literally intersects region, is our Generation Z and the generation following them. I think it's Generation Alpha. I think um, whatever the new name is going to be. But one, this is going to be the most, or is the most diverse generation in the history of our country. And that's number one. Two, because of their access to information and them being digital natives, they now know what's going on. They have more access to information and what's going on in the world than we have ever had. And so they can make assertions, they can galvanize, they can mobilize, they can speak up and quicker than we can or we ever have been able to. And so their expectations about what they consume, where they buy, who they work for are all going to be built into this intersection of social justice, on diversity, on equity, on inclusivity, because now it's a value proposition for that workforce because they grew up in an environment where their friends were just as diverse as anything what we subscribe to look like as a community. Yeah. And so that alone, I think, is not only the narrative globally, but it's the narrative of these young folks that are ultimately saying, if you do not do these things, I am not going to bring my talent here. I'm going to find another company. I'm going to buy another product. And in the same breath, I'm going to talk about your company if you don't do it. I'm going to put it on Twitter and talk about how horrible your company is for not doing this or for the mistake. So, I think it's a story that's evolving. And the cool thing that the other story that we're hearing is that our community, people outside the community are saying they can see the evolution of our community, especially those that are returning back to the area who left 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and they come back and say, wow, there's been a lot of changes for good. I'm hearing a lot of great things going on. And so I'm really excited again about our community, being a part of, our organization being a part of changing that narrative. And I call it, it's sort of like the stock market. I say we're trending up. We have some divots there. We make mistakes. My football coach said, hey, if you get tackled running the football, just fall forward. You're going to fall down anyway. Look, just fall forward. If you fall forward, you're going to be 1 inch closer to the end zone. And so our community has that attitude. We recognize that there's still a lot of challenges and we have a lot of community members that aren't experiencing the same success. But how do we communicate that we're working hard for them and being good stewards of the promise that ultimately we want for that our mission of our community actually states.
Mm-hmm. And that's so interesting because I think also I even saw because I left Raleigh for a while and then came back and it was like a different city. It's just incredible how we are changing for the better, right? We're heading in the right direction, and there is that willingness, right? As you mentioned, everybody's kind of on board on this. So, and I know that DEI is really at the forefront of also in the business world, right? Precisely for what you mentioned, it makes business sense. That's what the new generation want, right? They want to have that inclusivity, that equity, and diversity in the workspace. So when you see it, if a business has not really taken a dive into it, what are challenges that they can face as they starting to put into place a DEI, let's say, policy, where they start diving into it? What are challenges that you see businesses facing when they start diving into bringing diversity, equity, inclusion into their business internally, but also how they interact with their clients, the marketplace, and so forth?
It's the biggest challenge typically is the buy-in, especially of your colleagues, of employees. One of the things that we saw after, and I'll go back to this, I think the summer being a pivotal moment for some people to launch their work in this space. You saw companies almost feeling more comfortable making a stand in regards to social justice. And when you started seeing companies make statements saying that, speaking out against racism, speaking out against injustices. And when you make those statements, the question of the employees that have been working in said company for years, or maybe there's a reputation of said company, there's this question of how authentic is that statement if the strategy wasn't in place, if the work hadn't been done. So when companies launch into this work, I talk to leaders about, making sure that there's listening going on, that there's a lot of bringing people together in this space, understanding what the challenges are, understanding what the gaps are. I'm a believer of, I'm sort of steeped in the research methodology. That was the backdrop of my earlier career. And I believe that we have to do some quantitative and qualitative digging within a company to be able to understand the climate, to be able to understand and lift the voices of all folk, so that before you make that statement, before you start to implement a strategy, you spend the hard, and this is part of that interpersonal piece that's the hardest, because you're talking about not the product of the company or the service of the company. It's building that relationship before you need it. Because if you move forward and you're going a little faster than the rest of your base, then you are, you're ultimately not impacting the group that you intended the strategy for. And you do not want to have any barrier to the work is hard in itself, but you don't want the interpersonal part to be the hardest part of the work, and trying to get people to believe the authenticity. I tell this story, this example with my father, who he's a AME Zion preacher. I grew up in the church. I tell folks I don't even remember. I don't remember nothing. I feel like I was born in a pew. Like I don't remember nothing before that. I was born in the church. And my father, he's a politically minded man, a leader in the community. He was, and again, he had been a lifetime he's never been just a Democrat or just an independent. He's actually voted for different people for what they stand on, not because of their political affiliation. So I remember when with President Obama's first term and his first run towards the presidency, when he was on the ballot, my father could not bring it to him. He could not bring himself to vote for Obama, even though Obama aligned with his belief system. And he's never had a struggle like this before. He's always been able, as he taught us, take the emotionality out of elections. You just take it out. And he said, I'm not going to, vote or not vote to somebody because of their identity. I'm voting because of what they stand on. And so he believed what President Obama stood for, but he said that he could not vote for him. And when we dug deep, he never told us why. And so after he won he won the election. I never seen my dad cry before. And I called him and he was crying. And he said, the reason why I could not vote for him, he said, the reason why I could not bring myself is I could not get emotionally invested one more time into something that I thought could change this world. He said, because the fear of being let down, he said it would have killed him. The fear of, that it's almost like a learned hopelessness. It's that fear of being hopeful. Whereas he had been navigating this world, recognizing that he's a Black man having to navigate people that weren't out for his best interest. This is somebody who was born in the 40s. And so his reality was, hey, I'm never going to see a Black president, right? That being the symbol of that the world is changing and that our country is changing. And so what I'm saying is that you're not even on that large scale, but you have folks that have been marginalized working for you, your partner here, your coworker here, that have had their own personal experiences of this feeling of hopelessness. And if you can't help to get that person to a place where they can see that the strategies is maintained and wrought within a sense of we're going to move this thing forward, because the fear is you're doing it to check a box, you're doing it because somebody made you do it, or you're doing it just because you're trying to placate them. And my fear is that I don't want you to become another notch on my belt of being disappointed. And so you have to work on the interpersonal building a connectivity with your colleagues before you move to strategy. And that has been some of the more difficult challenges in launching successful DEI strategies, because you have incredible, well-intentioned leaders that are passionate about this work and they want to just accelerate and fly. But there's some reconciliation and healing that has to happen first. There has to be some honest conversations about, you may have a leader, that a CEO that was just hired 3 years ago, but the challenges have been existed for 30. And so you have to say, well, let's address the 30-year challenge. Let's talk. I may have not perpetuated it. I may have not been a part of those things, but I understand the history of them. And I need to have real honest conversations about how we can reconcile.
Wow, that's so interesting, and I think it's so powerful, right? Having that buy-in is and starting, you may have some really fantastic goals, but you got to start slow into it, right? But having a target in mind. So if we're looking at companies that are just diving into this, are there resources out there that they can use to, start having that internal conversation, reconciliation as well, and starting to build that buy-in and carry forward that vision?
Yeah, is when I came on board in 2018 to focus on the equity work, I referenced how that evolved to how we support our existing industries with diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So to that end, we actually launched in March of 2019 the Triangle DEI Alliance. And this alliance has been our opportunities to help support and create a learning community of the best practices in implementing DEI. Our alliance members in our communities, what we're ultimately trying to do is say that it's not just, the challenges of just IBM or just the challenges of green resources. We're saying, as a collection of companies, as a business community, as an ecosystem, we all need to contribute to the conversation to figure out how do we evolve and change. And so the DEI Alliance, through the providing of annual conferences on DEI roundtables for practitioners, having courageous conversations, that is a quarterly series that we have to really push the envelope. But these are this is the Alliance creates a space for people to share their secret sauce and to share those strategies and those resources. So triangledei.org is where we coalesce. That's our website. And that's where we put a lot of the resources that we ask and solicit companies to be able to go in and dig deep to really understand. But the learning from my perspective is not just, you can search, diversity, equity, and inclusivity strategies online, and there are a lot of different strategies out there. But building a learning community means that ultimately what you're doing is being able to talk to people about the nuts and bolts. When you decide to look at HR practices and hiring and recruitment strategies. So when I can talk to another practitioner about, hey, are there any partnerships that you built with our HBCUs, our historically Black colleges and universities, and how does that look like? And who was the right person to connect with? How do I build relationship? What are some areas of focus? And those conversations are incredibly meaningful because they were passed down from practitioner to practitioner. So a theory online may say, widen your net of recruitment, but how do I do that? What are the anchor institutions that I can rely on? How can we help build the ecosystem of our diverse recruitment workforce? How can we have conversations about artificial intelligence and bias in artificial intelligence? And folks to talk about, hey, listen, I've heard a story, and this has actually happened in one of our alliance conversations, where the guy said, listen, his name was Raymond Sutton. And he said, hey, I applied for this job for 8 months and I never got a call back. He said, my cousin told me to shorten my name to Ray. And to Ray Sutton, he got a call in 2 weeks. And so it talked about, well, companies that were using filtering out software that had bias because of humans still built the machinery. And so inadvertently or not, we don't know, he kept getting filtered out. He was devalued, even though he was brilliant, he had all the expertise. So even having conversations about blind resumes, removing identifiers of people, removing identifiers of what colleges they went to, because all of those things are contribute to how we view people. So if you told me, Martin, I know we're NC State family, but if you would have told me you went to Carolina, I wouldn't have done this interview. I wouldn't have talked to you. I wouldn't. I would have walked away.
That's so funny. But you know what? And what you've mentioned about resumes, I know somebody that had the same situation. They had to change their name, and immediately they started receiving calls for interviews. And it was kind of like he started feeling, you know what? I think this is hurting me for whatever reason, just my name, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about this, what are things that we as individuals can do also in our communities, right? In our organizations, wherever we're at, so that we're carrying that conversation forward, whether, the community we're at or the company that we're working for has, diversity, equity, inclusion as a robust program in there to drive the conversation forward. What are things that we can do that can have an impact?
Yeah. Well, in systems reform and systems change and implementation science, all the technical aspects of changing always starts with people, bottom line. And I lay out sort of a real easy way of looking at how do we change our belief systems, behaviors, and attitudes. I call it reach in. I call it the 3 R's: reach in, reach out, reach over. Reach in, that means doing your own self-assessment. That means checking on your own bias. That means expanding on your experiences, learning and connecting with people. That means connecting and understanding, how did I grow up and how did that shape how I view these things? And just personally to give you a little bit of me, I grew up again in the AME Zion Church that was very homophobic. And, coming out of that church and coming into, a college where I was interacting with a diverse set of people and learning and different lived experiences, and you just evolve, but if I was always in my own silo, or if I was in my own echo chamber, I would have never had that opportunity to learn, experience, live, play, be able to connect with others that had different lived experiences. So, I tell people all the time, you have to acknowledge, that we teach the way that we were taught. And once you acknowledge that, then that's a big part of the second R, which is reaching out. And that's how we connect to others. That's being mindful about what we share with others. Do we perpetuate our stereotypes? Do we unknowingly create inequities? Do I truly understand the lived experience of other people around me? When I recruit people, and research tells us we tend to recruit from our own nets. So am I throwing my net out wider? Am I thinking intently about whom I'm connecting with? And I tell people, if you're going to reach out, some of the best ways to reach out with people to learn about their lived experiences, one, just informally going out to drink and eat with somebody. That's a real easy way, right? Just over some food. I mean, heck, say, hey, what's your favorite dish? And you start to get some indications of sort of that cultural relevancy of how they view the world by just what we eat. And then at the same time, I would even say go outside of your box and think about sacred time that people dedicate for just their families. Figure out ways to be able, whether it be through worship or through play, connecting with folks in their place of worship is a way to have a cultural experience outside of yours. And it's not saying anything about your spiritual nature. It doesn't compromise you, but you just learn another experience. You understand and learn somebody's lived experience. So that's the reach out part, which takes some time. Now, reaching over is probably the hardest one out of all of them. Reaching over means, what are those barriers that are in place? And once we identify those barriers, the question is, once I've done a self-assessment, once I've connected and I understand the lived experience, recognizing that this country had been built on the premise that some people were not equal. And there are systems in place that are barriers to that success. And so I have to think about what resource, what rules, or what policy needs to be changed for me to reach over to ensure that everybody has access. So again, these are individual actions. and these can be done in every single step of your workday, every single step of your community, when you're in the community or with your family, when you're in the barbershop, when you're the hairstylist, if you hear someone saying something disparaging, you have your kids there, the hardest time to go against people is your family at Thanksgiving Day, right? And even to make the assumption that that's the only sacred time that we celebrate. We all have different ways of celebrating, right? That we are sitting around the table talking about things, and we all grew up in this vacuum. But Dad, let me talk to you about what you said about our LGBTQ community and the alphabet people, that the way what you call them. Let's talk about that. That's hard. That's tough. But if we could be brave enough, be courageous enough to build our muscle memory, to really stretch our neuroplasticity, to say that, it's almost like I tell my son all the time. I say, listening, I'm a hip hop head. I grew up in the golden era of hip hop. It's hard listening to hip hop music as an adult. It is hard because when I was listening to it as a 15-year-old, oh, it was the best thing since sliced bread. But listening to it as an adult, I have to go back and say, you know what? My favorite rap artist, he was wrong, right? I love the beat and I danced to it. I kissed my first girlfriend to it. All those great memories I had, but at the end of the day, I have to reconcile with what's real. And that's tough to do. So I would say, again, taking that adage, the 3 R's, reach in, reach out, reach over, is a really strong way for individuals to start into that work. I would also advocate for you all to look for resources that help expand who we are, and to get and understand the systems that have been in place historically that have created marginalized disparities, to get into some personal development and growth. You can go to this initiative that the DEI Alliance has launched, called A Better Wake. And this is for for Wake County specifically. It is about dismantling systemic racism. It acknowledges that the lived experience of Black and Brown residents are different than our white residents. And at abetterwake.com, you can we have a resources section that has videos, podcasts, books, all of these great resources to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusivity and systemic racism. And it's just great information talking about housing discrimination and how it impacts our marginalized communities' accumulation of wealth, and how that impacts economic mobility. So there's a lot of learning to be done. And I would say just sink your teeth into it and enjoy it. It's a beautiful struggle. It is a beautiful struggle. I am so excited every single day to be a part of these conversations.
This is fantastic. I love everything that you said. And we're hitting the top of the hour for a Q&A session, but I want to make sure that you share also what's coming up, a conference that we have coming up. Can you share a little bit about that?
I'm sorry, I broke up there for a second. What was that again? Can you restate?
Can you share a little bit about the conference that is coming up that I think you would be interested in knowing?
Absolutely. August 25th and 26th will be our 4th annual Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity Conference. It is our offering to the community in this space to talk about not only interpersonal skill building development, but also infrastructure conversation, those systems that need to be analyzed, talked about, audited, reimagined, from benefits packages to recruitment and retention, all of those great conversations. And it's going to be 2 days of really cool stuff. We're going to have some keynote speakers. I got one in the bag. I can't tell you who it's going to be, but we're going to have some amazing keynote speakers, and we have always great panels that are representative of our community to share their experiences and to also share their insights. So please join as an individual, and then if your company wants to be a part of either the Alliance or the conference to support, whether it be a sponsor or investing in the growth of the Alliance, please, I'll put my email in the chat. Reach out to me and let me know, is there any way that we can support building this incredible learning community?
Fantastic. Well, Danya, a fascinating conversation. I loved everything that you said. It has also broadened my horizons on certain areas that I'm going to start start doing action on my end. So I'm excited about that. So we have some questions here. Let me pull this up. First one we have from Scott Peacock. We have, what has been our community's biggest success in terms of DEI over the past 12 months? And what remains our biggest challenge?
Okay. Hey, what's up, Scott? Good to see your question. I would say right now, honestly, over the last 12 months, again, I've already, this will be the third time that I say it, but after this summer, again, the fact that our community is coalescing around this conversation around systems change and systems reform. We are working with RTI and coming up with a blueprint strategy around dismantling systemic racism in 4 major pillars, looking at education, criminal justice, economic mobility, and also health disparities. And so to see our community leaders and advocates, folks that have been working in this space for decades, along with people that are recognizing that they can use their voice and lend their influence to be able to impact change, we are all coalescing about how can we change and how can we challenge the norms to ensure that there's inclusive prosperity. And that, to me, the win for me is the sentiment, right? The win is we are not afraid of the counter narrative, which is that systemic racism isn't real. The counter narrative that diversity, equity, and inclusivity does not need to be baked into company culture. There is commentary that's really pushing back on a lot of this work. But at the end of the day, we stand on that intersection where it's not only good for business, but it's the right thing to do, and we are going to be on the right side of history. Now, challenge-wise, I will say it's in the details. It's in the implementation. It's having a community that has been impacted by inequitable recruitment. It's how do we build that infrastructure, but there's this impatient optimism that's going on. Like, folks are impatient. They're like, let's get it right. So I would say, the biggest challenge is about one, as we're building it, and folks are still trying to ride that bike while we build it. But there also has to be, how do we bring people along in the process? How do we make sure that we're communicating and being very transparent about the work? So that's why conversations like this is important, because we're talking about the collective vision. And I think the collective vision does not need to be just segmented for one particular group. It needs to be shared with everybody, but recognizing that the collective vision was created by the collective. It was created by the community. There were good stewards at the table that had our community in mind as we designed and came up with the direction that we're going. Great question, Scott.
All right, and we have another one here from Michael. I'm going to butcher your name. I'm sorry, Rukauskas. Michael, we have your question here. So, has the Chamber initiated any partnership efforts with St. Augustine and Shaw universities, as well as other higher education institutions like NC State and Wake Tech, relating to entrepreneurship?
That's a great question. We are, all of we are so blessed to have 6 colleges in one city, right? And every single one of them are partners at every level for our economic development work. We rely on, because they are a big chunk of how we get our talent in this community, right? So they are huge partners with us, and just in every conversation about our economic ecosystem and the prosperity of our community. Going deeper into how do we help support building young people that will get connected to entrepreneurship and through businesses. Shaw and St. Aug have been incredible partners with our work around Black Entrepreneurship Week, and also the creation of the, and it's still in place, but it's something that's being reimagined now, but the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center, which is at Shaw University. Of course, working with the Entrepreneurial and Innovation Center at NC State. These are partners that we are all ideating with through the work of not only the Chamber, but under the Chamber, there's a division called Innovate Raleigh that focuses in on the startup community. So there's a lot of intersection. There's a lot of projects going on. There's a lot of conversations being had. I think more importantly is how do we continue to share the notion of why entrepreneurship is important, to our Generation Z and then our Generation A's, our alphas. How do we continue to share that our small businesses, they're 80% of our ecosystem. And so the Chamber and Wake County Economic Development, we're being very mindful about, it's not just about, recruiting the big box company. It's not about these larger, IT, clean tech, advanced manufacturers. It's about also those small companies that we want to make sure that we're continuing that replenishing churn of companies that will be able to support and build and scale up. So that's a great question, and there's a lot of really cool partnerships that are going on out there.